Let's talk about one of the most fascinating 19th century Mormon historical figures that you've probably never heard of. Edward Tullidge was a theologian, journalist, historian, and public intellectual who shaped both how Mormons thought of their theology and history, as well as how the broader public thought about the Mormon tradition. He converted and was a very prolific and successful missionary. He migrated to Utah and became a trusted writer. He was sent to New York City to represent the faith to the world, and he authored some of the most important early historical books of Utah. But his affiliation with the LDS tradition waxed and waned throughout his career. At some times he left the faith only to rejoin. At one point he became an atheist, and then a Godbeite, and then a Josephite, and he wrote throughout all these different stages of his process, which is why I've called him a career convert. Now, I'm biased. I love Edward Tullidge's story because it's just so fascinating and it touches on so many crucial topics of Mormonism. I actually wrote an essay on him that was published in Dialogue, a Journal of Mormon Thought, while I was a graduate student. I appeared on Radio West a couple of years ago to discuss him with Doug Fabrizio on that wonderful radio program. And in both cases, I argue that Tullidge's story is not just interesting in its own sake, but it certainly is interesting for its own sake. But it's also interesting because it touches on so many crucial tensions of the 19th century church. So I hope you'll forgive me in this video to geek out a little bit about the life and thought of Edward Tullidge. In this video, I'll summarize the from birth to death, what he did. I'll touch on where he intersected with some of the most important moments in Mormon history. I'll even share some of my favorite passages from his writings to show you what a captivating author he was. And then I'll close by exploring some of the lasting legacies on why his life is still important. Edward Tullidge was born on September 30th, 1829 in Weymouth, Dorset, in a rural part of England. He was apprenticed by the age of 12 to be a coach printer, but then converted to the Mormon tradition at the age of 19 in the year of 1848. And the very next year, at the year of 20, he dedicated himself to being a missionary for the church. But that did not last long, because by 1852, he had backslid from his Mormon conversion and became a deist. This is a statement that was given by a missionary who was a missionary at this time. He gave this statement later, which does color his reflection a bit, but it does capture the basic contours that are backed up by contemporary documents. This is from Job Smith. Quote, "Went to Buckingham to visit E.W. Tullidge, one of the traveling elders sent from our conference at Bedford to raise up a branch of the church. Found him at the house of a deist. I soon learned that he had forsaken his mission and Mormonism, and that he was now a disbeliever in all revealed religion. I reasoned with him, but soon found it altogether in vain. He expressed his disbelief in the prophet Joseph, in the present authorities, and in the whole system. And in respect to God, he, quote, did not know anything of him, but if God should curse or otherwise punish him for disbelieving Mormonism, yea, if he were consuming in hell by him, he would then rise up and damn him. At Brother Underwood's request that same evening, I excommunicated him from the church, and this at his own request." So there you see his first move into Mormonism, then backslid into deism, but then that does not stick, because by 1854, 2 years later, Tullidge is once again a Mormon missionary, and now he's writing for the church. And what's most interesting to me is he's writing essays that directly refute the deist arguments that he had just previously argued for. So here, for instance, is an essay published in the church's Millennial Star in 1858 on revealed religion. Note that this is just 2 years after he says revealed religion's wrong. Now he's arguing on behalf of revealed religion. Quote, "Men have fallen into a great error in treating religion as an abstract speculation and making it evaporate in a few prayers and absurd ceremonies, inasmuch as it is real and practical government. Its aims and scope are to solve the social problem and define the relation of man to man and of man to God, and give the main motives of all action, and to be the teacher of art, science, and philosophy. In short, it is a theocracy which, viewed from what point you will, reveals its divine source." So you see, Mormonism is the solution to disbelief, a reversal of the very types of arguments he had previously been presenting. Before I go much further, just a very quick reminder of handling the channel business. I apologize, I have to do this in every video, but remember that if you enjoy this type of content, you can subscribe to this channel where I do deep dives on topics every Monday. I connect the past to the present on Wednesday, and on Fridays, I pull back the curtains on the historian's craft. And if you want to give back, and I'm so grateful for the many of you who have given back, you can become a member, where for a nominal fee, you get early access to videos, you get little icons next to your name when you leave comments, you get to ask questions that I may answer in Mailbag Mondays, and most importantly, you can feel good about supporting public-facing, rigorous scholarship. And I also recommend subscribing to my free Kit newsletter, where I send out what they call broadcasts every couple weeks or so, and you can follow me on my different platforms, especially Instagram. So that's all the business. Now let's move back to Edward Tullidge. As Tullidge earns his way back into the church and the trust of its leadership, he starts taking a more prominent role, even while he's still in England. By 1856, so 4 years after he backslid into deism, he is now working for the church's Millennial Star, their newspaper based out of Liverpool, by 1856. However, the next year, as word comes out of America of the Mountain Meadows massacre and the Utah War, Edward Tullidge starts becoming disillusioned. And he's not public about this. He later dates it to his response to the Utah War and the Mountain Meadows massacre, but it does not appear as much in his writings. But what does appear in his writings is his desire to start reorienting the Mormon faith toward a much more political and metaphysical idea that is separated from this theocratic origins. Again, the same types of theocracy he had been presenting in his 1856 essay. By 1858, he believes that his vision of Mormonism is going to be crucial as the faith takes its next step. And he writes Brigham Young to explain that desire, saying that his future work on Mormonism is going to be for the faith what Homer and Milton were for Western civilization. And that it would, quote, be 3 times as extensive and more complicated than any poetic work yet undertaken. Now, you can see that he had high hopes for his endeavor. Eventually, he finally migrates to Utah in 1861, where he soon receives his endowment, was called as a 70 back when that was a priesthood office, and he believed he had found his goal. And this is how he writes Brigham Young with his desire of what to do next. Quote, "I earnestly desire to enter your service. I have set my heart upon this thing for years, to be entirely in your hands and to have my life directed by yours. Have been given one aim of, this has been the one great aim of my ambition. I shall never rest until I am in your hands, nor be satisfied until I have engaged in your service. I can work at the shoemaking. I care not in what form I am employed within my capabilities, so that I am set to work by you." That is a letter of deep devotion. Unfortunately, it does not last long. Brigham Young does not appear swayed by that 1861-1862 letter, but Tullidge does start gaining in reputation in Utah. In part because he's expanding the definition of Mormonism, though he would always use Mormondom. Mormondom was his way of emphasizing the people, the kingdom, rather than the unique theologies. In 1862, he commenced a series of 70 lectures in Utah on various topics, including the universality of Mormonism. So you see this broad scope coming into play. He almost converts to the RLDS Church in 1864 when some missionaries come out. Set a pin on that because that's going to be important later. And then with a fellow British convert, E.T. Harrison, he starts a newspaper, the Peep o' Day magazine, in 1864, the first literary magazine in the Intermountain West. It was secretly funded by disaffected Mormons, and it was actually published at Camp Douglas, the military establishment, though on its masthead it said it was published in the 20th Ward to try to prove its Mormon bona fides. Tullidge would call this an attempt at a social revolution. And he is able to keep that quiet enough, the dissenter part, and his public works, especially his lectures, does get approval from church leaders. And he gets hired by the church in 1864 to work in the church historian's office, turning Wilford Woodruff's diaries into a narrative history, which he does for 2 years. That project, however, starts making Tullidge go mad because he cannot correlate the history of the church as he's finding through Wilford Woodruff's diaries with his vision of what Mormonism should be. So finally in 1866, he decides, okay, it's not working for me here in Utah. He gets approval from Brigham Young to travel to New York City to become basically the church's spokesperson to the elite educated liberal establishment. He publishes a series of very influential essays in major newspapers in New York City explaining Mormonism to the world, but a Mormonism that was in Tullidge's own image. This is how he describes it in one of his essays. Quote, "The Mormon religion is a nationality, and their church a part of the Republic of America. Whether in Utah or scattered among the nations of Europe, they are virtually part and parcel of a large social body and territory on this continent. Mormondom," there you see the term, Mormondom is a unit, religiously, socially, and nationally, even though scattered throughout the whole world. So here you see Tullidge viewing Mormonism as a people, working as a social unit, while downplaying some of its distinct doctrines. That's a tenuous balance, and it certainly wasn't going to last long. Because when Tullidge arrives back in Utah around 1868, he finally joins a schism group that he had been flirting with for a while, a group that forms around William Godbeite, known as the Godbeites. Now, the Godbeites are one of the most fascinating stories in Mormonism that I'll need to do a video on at some point, because they're an interesting liberal dissenting group that critiques both some of Brigham Young's more extreme ideas and theologies and doctrines like polygamy, while also critiquing the church's economic stance and Brigham Young's control over the economy. So when Tullidge returns in 1868. He took charge of the Utah Magazine, a magazine that had been started by William Godbeite and Tullidge's old missionary buddy Harrison, who were now gone to New York City. Now, while he was running the Utah Magazine, he was still peripherally a Latter-day Saint. He was still emphasizing that he was loyal to the church, even though secretly he was associating with the Godbeites. He wrote several editorials defending Brigham Young against some critiques, even though he still maintained that the church only held social and economic purposes, rejecting theological exclusivity. Interestingly, Brigham Young, at least at first, continued to support Tullidge, including when his health relapsed. But by early 1869, as the Godbeite schism comes to fruition and there are massive excommunications, Tullidge publicly joins the Godbeite movement and calls it pure Mormonism. He was, as a result, temporarily disfellowshipped on October 16, 1869, which eventually led to formal church proceedings. And while he was facing excommunication, he struggled with what to do. And then he finally decided to resign his membership. And he wrote this poignant letter to Brigham Young, emphasizing his hesitancy with Young's temporal theocracy. So there you see this liberal critique of the Mormon Empire. He would then go on to publish many editorials, including letters to the New York Press, announcing that this new Godbeite church is a movement of progressive intellectuals trying to force Mormonism into the modern age. Here is, for instance, an excerpt of one of those letters. Quote, "But we have been cut off from a small portion of God's family, and now we belong to the whole world. Brethren of humanity's great search everywhere, think with all the intellect and light of the age, and we will think and speak from your own lofty platforms. Do you not see that we are coming out of our isolation to give you greeting in God's and humanity's cause? Do you not see that Mormon elders are opening their hearts to all mankind? We will no longer be a sect, but a world." Those are bold statements that capture this vision of the Godbeite movement. Unfortunately, you're probably not going to be shocked when I tell you this, his affiliation with the Godbeites turns out to be brief. Within a few months, he has a fight with many of the leaders, in part because he himself starts backsliding. He worries he made the wrong decision. He starts drinking. He leaves Utah for New York, where he thinks he's going to start writing plays for the world. The world rejected them. Finally, returning back to Utah in June 1871, became the associate editor of the Salt Lake Tribune. The Salt Lake Tribune was started as a newspaper by the Godbeites to present an alternate voice to the church, but that did not last long due to his complicated relationship with the Godbeites. So by 1872, he was once again all on his own without a church or community to embrace him. But if you for a moment think that at that point his life slows down and he must just kind of fall back into some normalcy, that does not happen because there are still plenty of changes to come. He loses his position with the Salt Lake Tribune. He decides to try to earn his graces back with the LDS Church. So he wrote to Brigham Young in 1874, once again hoping to join the fold. And Brigham Young, because they did have a warm relationship, at least gave some gestures toward affiliation, though he does not get rebaptized. But he does get access to the sources, and he writes a trilogy of really important books that shape LDS theology and history. He wrote A Life of Brigham Young, Utah and Her Founders in 1876, one of the first big biographies of Brigham Young. He then wrote Women of Mormondom in 1877, a focus on Mormon women and how they are the heart of the Mormon tradition, which is a very prescient argument that other scholars aren't going to pick up for a long time. And then he writes The Life of Joseph the Prophet in 1878, one of the first massive biographies of Joseph Smith. And these are very well received within the church. But while Brigham Young seems to tolerate Edward Tullidge during this time, Young's successor, John Taylor, does not. One of my favorite letters from John Taylor to Edward Tullidge critiqued him for his faltering allegiance. John Taylor was always a black and white type of guy. You're either all in or you're all out. And this is what he wrote to Tullidge, quote, "When in the East you are an apostate because it is expected your book will sell better. Here you are a saint because to be a saint pays better." In other words, I don't trust your allegiance. I don't trust your loyalty. And so he loses the patronage of the Utah elite. Then he does not stop. Because he loses the support of the LDS Church, he turns his attention to the RLDS Church, the reorganized tradition founded by Joseph Smith III in 1860. He becomes a convert. He goes on missionary work. He even rewrites his Life of Joseph biography to support the RLDS cause rather than the LDS cause. It's a fascinating story of how he goes through and revises that history to meet those different needs. However, that, again, and I know this is going to shock you, does not last long because he returns to Utah on a mission in October 1879, but ends up staying. He doesn't rejoin the LDS Church, although he does rejoin the LDS community. He writes a number of plays, edits a magazine, the Tullidge Quarterly Magazine, writes a history of the Salt Lake City, which is funded by the municipal council, marries again to Susanna Ferguson. He was married plurally decades before. Neither marriage ended in children or long lasting, so he finally has children with Susanna Ferguson in the 1880s, who bore him 10 children, only 5 of whom survived childhood. And then Tullidge dies on May 21st, 1894. There's a picture of his gravestone in the Salt Lake City Cemetery. I told you, it was a wild ride. So what are some of the legacies from Edward Tullidge? Where I can focus on at least 3. 1, he shaped how Mormonism was viewed by the general public, especially in New York City. And this is in part because he was presenting an image of Mormonism more conversant and converging with mainstream culture, especially liberal Protestantism. And so therefore, New Yorkers and the Eastern press chose to believe Tullidge that he was a faithful representative of the LDS Church. So he shaped public visions of Mormonism more than nearly anyone else in the 19th century. Second, due to his affiliation with the Godbeite movement and him being the court historian of the Godbeites, we often view the Godbeite movement in his eyes. In other words, he shapes the history and theology of Godbeites in the way that he wanted them to be seen, rather than how the Godbeites should actually be seen. It wasn't until historians recently who actually dug into the sources who were like, hey, the Godbeites don't really match what Tullidge presented them as. And again, maybe I'll do a video at some point in the future if there's interest on the Godbeite schism. And finally, I think Edward Tullidge really framed how many see Mormon women. His 1877 book, Women of Mormondom, which he wrote in allegiance and collaboration with Eliza R. Snow, ends up being a crucial source to understanding Mormon women and polygamy and theology. And it's worth its own video on its own right, but it's a fascinating work that is still worth reading now. Anyways, Thank you for staying with me as I geek out about Edward Tullidge, one of my favorite and most fascinating figures of 19th century Mormonism, because he shows the blurred boundaries between all these different communities that he moved to throughout his life, writing his way through the entire way. History has never been more relevant than it is today, and Edward Tullidge both saw that himself, and his record helps reaffirm that point, which is why I think his story is important.